Welcome to Holocaust Museum Houston's virtual programs. Thank you for taking time out and being here this evening. I'm Tamara Savage, Managing Director and Director of Public Programs, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our recorded webcast with guest speaker, Dr. Ronnie Mikel Arieli from Israel. We are fortunate to have the traveling exhibit Mandela, Struggle for Freedom on view at our museum until January the 3rd. And if you live in the Houston area, we encourage you to visit our museum and go through this very fine exhibit. Before the introduction of our speaker, I'd like to just mention a few things. The chat and Q&A boxes have been disabled as this is a pre-recorded presentation. A recording of the program will be available through our YouTube platform at a later date. We will be sending out this information via email to all registrants within the next day or two. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Ronnie Mikel Arieli, who will discuss the topic, Reading the Diary of Anne Frank on Robben Island. Dr. Ronnie Mikel Arieli is a cultural historian interested in the intersections between Holocaust memory, contemporary Jewish history, and human rights. She's currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem, working on her research project, Jewish Deportees in Mauritius, 1940 to 1945, a history from the margins. She holds a PhD in Jewish history and contemporary Jewry from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Her first authored book, titled Remembering the Holocaust in a Racial State, Holocaust Memory in South Africa, From Apartheid to Democracy, 1948 to 1994, will be published in 2021 in the Dechrela series, New Perspectives on Modern Jewish History. Dr. Mikel Arieli has received several awards, including the 2020 Young Researcher Scholarship, the 2018 Robert Wistrich Prize for Outstanding Research into Anti-Semitism, the 2016 Barbara Halpern Prize for Outstanding Students, the 2016 Wiesenthal Award for Outstanding Doctoral Students, and the 2015 Yad Vashem International Institute for Holocaust Research Scholarship. She's the author of numerous publications, the most recent one being Between Apartheid, the Holocaust and Nabka, Archbishop Desmond Tutu's Pilgrimage to Israel-Palestine, 1989, and the Emergence of Political Interest. Over to you now, Dr. Mikel Arieli. Thank you.
And I would like to open by thanking Tamara and the Holocaust Museum Houston team for inviting me to this series of talks. I will start by sharing my screen. So on the morning of October 15, 1989, Ahmed Muhammad Kathrada was released from Portsmouth Maximum Security Prison near Cape Town. A South African Indian veteran of the anti-apartheid struggle, treason trialist, and long-serving political prisoner, Kathrada had spent 26 years and 3 months in prison, 18 years of which were on Robben Island. Leaving his prison cell, Kathrada carried with him some cardboard boxes containing his most prized belongings. A copy of the Oxford Book of English Verse, The Complete Works of William Shakespeare, 900 cardboard copies of letters he had written, and an equivalent number of letters he had received, and 7 secret notebooks on which Kathrada had secretly recorded inspiring passages he had encountered over the years. In his 3rd notebook, Kathrada recorded 13 entries from the Diary of Anne Frank, which was smuggled onto Robben Island in the late 60s. In an interview with Tim Cousins from 2008, Kathrada stated, "Anne Frank made an immediate impact on me personally. Of course, as people read that, it made an impact on all the prisoners who read the Anne Frank. There was a similarity, although Anne Frank's position was much worse than ours. But there was a similarity. She was being persecuted with her family because she was Jewish, and Jews were persecuted tremendously. As you know, they were the main target of Nazism. And this statement is essential for understanding Cattrada's reading of the Diary of Anne Frank on Robben Island as a means of articulating his own position as a political prisoner of the apartheid regime. It expresses his recognition of Anne Frank's Jewish identity and of the particular and unique circumstances of the Holocaust. The emphasis he places on the differences between the historical circumstances in which he lived and those of Anne Frank is critical in marking the particularity of the Jewish genocide, and it allows Cattrada to mark the diary as an inspiration for his own struggle, while without blurring or distorting the unprecedented historical events of the Holocaust. Cattrada's statement corresponds with a phenomenon that the historian Dominique Lacapra defines as empathic unsettlement, a person's response to the testimony of trauma victims that involves historical understanding and emotional identification with the victim. And Lacapra distinguishes between empathic unsettlement and identification. While the latter tends to blur the distance between the self and the other, the former moves in the opposite direction and acknowledges the basic otherness of the subject and of the historical event. The empathic unsettlement is not driven by the desire to step into someone else's shoe. Instead, it allows a given subject to recognize in the trauma of the other some traumatic dimensions of his own experiences, while recognizing otherness and difference as inevitable components of social relations. And this is also relevant to the use of analogies. And Keith Feldman argues that an analogy is never perfect because two given events are never identical. Feldman recognizes at the core of the analogy sits a difference, and I quote, always on the verge of collapse into identity socially produced under contextually specific conditions that are always on the verge of conflation, end of quote. However, it is this permanent conditions that holds an analogy together and produces its rhetorical effectivity. And so, in order to draw analogical connections between Anne Frank's situation and his own, Cattrada first acknowledges the differences and only then moves to point to the similarities. And this brings us to a very influential book by Michael Rothberg called Multidirectional Memory, where he marks a claim for possible productive interactions between Holocaust memory and other traumatic memories of decolonization, racism, and legacies of slavery. And he argues that the public articulation of collective memory by marginalized or oppositional social groups can provide resources for other groups to articulate their own claims for recognition and justice. And following Rothberg's multidirectional memory paradigm and Lacapra's concept of empathic unsettlement, in this lecture, I will engage with the reading of the Diary of Anne Frank by political prisoners of the apartheid regime on Robben Island. So, how it all started. 2 months before my third visit to South Africa in 2016, I came across a Facebook post by the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center about an event they had organized marking World Refugee Day. They invited a very special key speaker, Ahmed Cattrada. I saw the opportunity and asked Tali Nates, the great friend of mine and of course the center director, to try and put me in touch with Cattrada. And on Friday morning, 11 August 2016, I had a privilege to meet Cattrada in his apartment in Johannesburg. He received me with open arms and was keen to share his fascinating life story with me. Unfortunately, Cattrada died 6 months after the interview, on 28 March 2017, at the age of 87. The lecture today will present a careful reading of Cattrada's 13 entries from the Diary of Anne Frank, in conjunction with some of his own memories and personal documents, and of course the interview that I conducted with him in 2016, And this material will be combined with testimonies of other political prisoners of the apartheid regime, among them Nelson Mandela, Govan Mbeki, and Patrick Lekota, on their own individual readings of the diary during their imprisonment. But before heading on to Robben Island, it is important to note that throughout the 40s and the 50s, anti-apartheid activists in South Africa and abroad focused their rhetoric on delineating the parallels between policies of racial discrimination put into practice by the apartheid regime and by the Nazi regime. For example, in its June 1945 Declaration of the Nations of the World, the non-European unity movement invoked an extended comparison between the life of Blacks, Indians, and Coloreds in South Africa and the life of Jews in Nazi Germany. Similar positions also emerged among the Indian population in South Africa following the internal public discourse on local segregation policy in the 30s and the 40s. Several observers of mid-century South Africa have noted that the anti-Indian atmosphere echoed core tropes of anti-Semitism, evident in claims that the Indian was actually the Jew of Africa. And historian John Salk argued that, and I quote, the Nazi genocide served as a powerful point of comparison and rendered the situation of the Indian diaspora legible in terms of international discourses over human rights, minorities, and the cause of the Second World War, end of quote. So such comparison was invoked in 1946 when the South African Indian Congress Passive Resistance Movement launched a campaign against the Asiatic Land Tenure and Indian Representation Act, also known as the Ghetto Act, to protest both the limited political representation afforded Indian South Africans and the restriction of their living areas. The use of the term ghetto in this context was undoubtedly imbued with the resonance of its use by the Nazi regime. And in fact, Kathrada was very much active in this campaign and had frequently invoked the Nazi analogy, drawing connections between the local repressive legislation towards Indians and elements of Hitler's policy towards the Jews. And in June 1951, Kathrada left South Africa to serve as the head of the Africa desk of the World Federation of Democratic Youth headquarters in Hungary. And during this visit, which actually deserves a separate lecture, I will just give you a brief taste of it. He went to the Warsaw Ghetto and to the Auschwitz concentration camp, where he penned searing reflections on race, identity, and resistance. And later, in his speeches, he constantly invoked Auschwitz as a reminder of the horrors of the Jewish Holocaust in an effort to promote non-racialism in South Africa. As Kathrada's European Odyssey in 1951 clearly influenced his early struggle against apartheid, it is safe to assume that those early insights also seeped into his experiences and his continued struggle on Robben Island, and in particular into his deep personal reading of the Diary of Anne Frank. On July 11, 1963, the police raided on Liliesleaf Farm in the Johannesburg suburb of Rivonia, purchased by Arthur Goldreich on behalf of the Communist Party of South Africa. During the raid, Kathrada, Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Raymond Mahalaba, Lionel Bernstein, and Bob Happel were arrested. Some other activists were arrested shortly after the Liliesleaf raid, and this arrest led to the infamous Rivonia trial held on June 11, 1964, in which 8 defendants, including Nelson Mandela, who was arrested before the raid, were each charged with 2 counts of sabotage and sentenced to life imprisonment with hard labor. On June 13, 1964, the convicted Black South Africans landed on Robben Island to begin their life sentence. Robben Island has always figured in South African history as the ultimate place of exclusion, used over its history as an asylum hospital, a facility for imprisoning slaves, traditional leaders, and chiefs who resisted British colonial authorities, a place for incarceration of lepers, and finally, a prison for political prisoners of the apartheid regime. In his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela terms Robben Island another country. And indeed, during apartheid rule, the island figured both as a foreign place so radically cut off from South Africa as to be almost unknowable, and as a mirror of South Africa, where the restrictions of the apartheid regime were replicated. And one replication of the apartheid restrictions on the island was manifested through prison censorship of the reading material the inmates received from the outside world. Books and letters were censored, and prisoners were not allowed to have newspapers until 1980. Robben Island soon became the principal site for apartheid incarceration of political prisoners, and because the island held the largest concentration of political prisoners during apartheid rule, it soon became a pivotal component of the evolution of anti-apartheid policies. For most of the men on the island, surviving imprisonment was their own way to contribute to the liberation struggle, and they frequently challenged the prison conditions to secure both their physical and mental survival. The Rivonia trialists were held on a separate single cell courtyard, officially designated Section B, but known to all prisoners as the leadership section, cut off from the general sections. This division was intended to separate between the prisoners and to prevent communication between them. However, with time, prison conditions slowly improved and the degree of separation likewise diminished over the years. The need for communication between the different sections, as well as with the outside world, drove the prisoners to establish the communication committee led by Kathrada. And this committee focused both on facilitating effective means of communicating among the different sections of the prisons and on establishing a smuggling system for banned material. Kathrada explained its working during our interview, and he says, about 25 of us were completely isolated from the rest of the prison community, with Mandela and others. The others were in the communal cells, so our experiences were different. And we had to do a lot of smuggling, which took place mainly in the communal cells, where there were hundreds of prisoners, and some of them worked in the warders' houses. We were not allowed to have newspapers for 14 years, so we kept ourselves informed, and our colleagues working at the warders' houses just took newspapers from there and then copied items of interest and smuggled them into us. While outside news was the top priority for the island smuggling network, books too became converted objects for smuggling, since they were not readily available and often censored by the prison authorities with no actual reason. And it's interesting because prison regulation from 1965 required the establishment and maintenance of a proper library for all prisoners, including those imprisoned on Robben Island. And while the library in the general sections of Robben Island was indeed operational at the end of 1965, the library in B section, where Kathrada, Mandela, Walter Sisulu, and other senior political prisoners were held, received only a very restricted number of books during the 60s and the 70s. When I asked Kathrada why the Diary of Anne Frank was forbidden on Robben Island, he stated, "We had to smuggle it in because the wardens would not allow it, not because they were aware of Anne Frank, they were completely ignorant. It is just that they rule that they only allow books that are directly connected to our studies. So things like Anne Frank and quite a few books we had to smuggle in. And we succeeded in it. And of course, the younger people were really interested. So we circulated this book. There was a sizable number of prisoners who were also internationalists and who knew of Nazism. So when we were smuggling the Diary of Anne Frank and other books, they copied parts of the books so that they could be circulated much more. What happened with Anne Frank in particular was that some of the prisoners copied the whole diary and circulated it among us prisoners. I copied only chosen parts to my private notebooks. And Catrada's testimony above regarding the importance of the diary to political prisoners on Robben Island became known to the public during the period of transition from apartheid to democracy. In March 1994, on the eve of the first democratic election in the country, the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam, in collaboration with the South Africa Jewish Board of Deputies and the Netherlands Royal Embassy in Pretoria, presented a traveling exhibition entitled Anne Frank in the World in several cities in South Africa. And given the national itinerary of this exhibition and its symbolic importance, the former political prisoners, now national leaders, were among the key speakers at the various events launching the exhibition. And the first to testify on the importance of the diary was Governor Mbeki, one of the activists sentenced to life imprisonment during the Rivonia trial in 1964. And Mbeki spoke at the opening of the exhibition in Port Elizabeth, stating, one first became familiar with Anne Frank's diary in circumstances similar to the conditions in which she lived. It was on Robben Island, while serving a life sentence for opposing racism, that one first read Anne Frank's diary. The Rivonia group of prisoners lived in a separate section, away from the other political prisoners, and it was there that Anne Frank's diary landed into our hands. How it came is a matter I cannot explain, but it was passed from person to person to be read only in the evenings after we had been locked up. The pages had already fallen apart. And Becky testified that beside the Bible, the only other book he read during his imprisonment on Robben Island was the Diary of Anne Frank. He actually emphasizes that the circumstances under which the diary had been written were similar to those in which he and the other ANC prisoners found themselves. He tells that Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu were not allowed to speak to each other. And I quote, "We had to live in official silence, like Anne Frank. If I wanted to communicate with Nelson Mandela, I could not speak to him. I wrote a note on a piece of paper, and we contrived to pass it between cells." Upon reading the diary, Mbeki realized that this book is a book that all prisoners should read. And I quote, he says, "It had to be shared. And the frustration was that you couldn't tell your friends what the book meant to you. So we wrote it out using those of us who had small handwriting. And it was soon read by all prisoners in all 7 sections." And he ended the interview he gave to the South African newspaper saying, "We must remember that others also suffered from the use of force and that the Holocaust is nothing but the worst of the many stains in human history." The recognition of the unprecedented cruelty of the Nazis and of Jewish suffering in Europe was also reflected in the opening event of the exhibition in Bloemfontein where Patrick Lakota, who was arrested and sent to Robben Island in September 1974 for his activities in the South African Student Association around his involvement in organizing events to mark Mozambique's independence, said, "The invitation to talk to you this evening was indeed a privilege. It recalled immediately to my mind some of the literature that inspired myself and others as we went through our years in detention on Robben Island. Works which reflected on the experiences of the Second World War, the determination of the Jewish people to survive and overcome the most vicious system. It is a wonder," and this is a quote, "it is a wonder that I haven't dropped all my ideals because they seem so absurd and impossible to carry out. Yet I keep them because in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." Those are the words of Anne Frank. These words are unfitting a 14-year-old girl. In them is carried immense wisdom, vision, reason, and depth of understanding of human being that is unparalleled. And in a similar vein, Nelson Mandela, at the opening of the Johannesburg exhibition in August 1994, stated, "During the many years my comrades and I spent in Robben Island, we derived inspiration from the courage and tenacity of those who challenge injustice, even under the most difficult circumstances. As my colleague Gordon Becky indicated at the Port Elizabeth exhibition, some of us read Anne Frank's diary on Robben Island and derived much encouragement from it. Combined with news of the heroic struggle of the people led by the ANC, as well as the support of the international community, the tales of heroes and heroines of Anne's caliber kept our spirit high and reinforced our confidence in the invincibility of the cause of freedom and justice." And it is important to note that when the diary was smuggled onto Robben Island, Anne Frank was already the most iconic victim of the Holocaust, mainly due to the dramatic adaptations of her diary on Broadway and on film in 1955 and 1959. And while the adaptation of Frank's text brought the Holocaust to the forefront of mass consciousness, it did not really seek to dispel the curiously functional amnesia towards the events themselves. This amnesia had to do with the consolidation of a homogeneous Western identity during the 50s and the 60s. And I remind you, it is the shadows of the Cold War, and the adaptation of the diary were made to conform to construct of universalized suffering palatable to an American audience. And the overall message was of the virtues of American democracy with universalism as the principal vehicle of this ideological agenda. And in this process, some of Anne Frank's musing about Jewish suffering were omitted altogether, while others were transformed into declarations about the universal nature of suffering. While the adaptation versions were not circulated on Robben Island, the diary in its original form served as an important source of inspiration for the prisoners. And Shirley Gilbert described the significance of the diary for some of the prominent political prisoners. However, she argues that it was only after their release from prison during the transition to democracy that the former political prisoners incorporated the diary into what she refers to as a consensual memory in the new South Africa, casting Anne Frank as a universal victim of discrimination. While Mandela, Mbeki, and Lekota's spoken testimonies of the reading of the diary of Anne Frank were made in retrospect, and as Shirley Gilbert argues, paved the way for the memory of the Holocaust to become part of the new South African collective memory, Kathrada's entries in his prison notebook are the only available written evidence of the smuggling of the diary into prison and its frequent circulation among the political prisoners at the time. So the last section of my lecture will focus on some of Kathrada's individual reading of the diary through a textual examination of some of his entries, and the notebook that he had, I call it the Diary of Diaries, provides a glimpse into his individual reading of the diary as a mirror of his own experiences, insights, and beliefs. Most of the quotations from the diary that appears in Kathrada's notebooks can be interpreted as forging imaginative links between his experiences of political imprisonment while isolated on Robben Island and the experiences of a Jewish girl hiding in Nazi-occupied Amsterdam. Anne Frank's endurance while in hiding and her emphasis on the importance of remaining optimistic even under the worst circumstances appear as a recurring theme in Kathrada's recorded entries. The entries invite us to reconsider the importation of the term annex specific to Frank's experience into the context of apartheid and more specifically of Kathrada's experiences of imprisonment in the Robben Island cell. And I will give you one example. So the first example that I will give is from February 12, 1944, where Anne Frank wrote, "The sun is shining, the sky is deep blue, there is a lovely breeze and I'm longing, so longing for everything, to talk, for freedom, for friends, to be alone." This entry particularly resonated with prisoners enduring the hard conditions on Robben Island through the mid-60s. And years later, Kathrada wrote in his memoir a similar contemplation, nor could I possibly have realized that it would be 2 decades before I would see a child again, or that we would have to adapt to living with grown men in conditions where I could never see the stars in the night sky. This is only one example out of most of the entries recorded by Kathrada, which reflected his identification with the conditions of Frank's incarceration and with her enduring optimism. However, I would like to turn now to chosen entries which also reveal a particular identification with Jewish suffering during the Holocaust. On May 22, 1944, Anne Frank wrote in her diary, "Is discord going to show itself while we are still fighting? Is the Jew once again worth less than another? Oh, it is sad, very sad, that once more, for the umpteenth time, the old truth is confirmed. What one Christian does is his own responsibility. What one Jew does is thrown back at all Jews." And in her description of Jewish suffering as the outcome of racial prejudice, Frank seeks to criticize the perception of Jews as a determinist racial category. She points to the essentialism driving anti-Semitism, which assumes that any individual partakes by virtue of birth of the presumed attributes of the group to which he belongs. And this entry, copied by Kathrada, reflects on anti-Semitism and indicates that he was keenly aware of the parallels between Nazi racial discrimination and the racist separatism that underlines apartheid policies. And it is important to know that as a child during the war, Kathrada had various encounters with right-wing Afrikaner, pro-Nazism, and the direct influence of Nazism on apartheid ideology did not escape his recollections. In his interview, he stated, and I quote, "They, the nationalists, were direct disciples of Hitler. I mean, they made it clear their policy was taken from the Third Reich," end of quote. As I mentioned earlier, most of the proto-fascist organizations of that period in South Africa did not focus only on the Jewish question, but also targeted Indians as a threat to society. And to be sure, Kathrada was only 9 during the war. However, his childhood recollections described above, as well as his later involvement in the passive resistance campaign against the Ghetto Act of 1946, reveal his awareness of these developments. And by choosing Anne Frank's musing on anti-Semitism, Kathrada not only drew analogical connections between anti-Semitism and other forms of racism, but also reveals the direct connections between Afrikaner nationalism and Nazi Germany as the basis of this analogy. And in another entry chosen by Kathrada, which was written by Anne Frank on April 11, 1944, Frank looks forward to a time when she and her family will be defined by their shared humanity. We have been pointedly reminded that we are in hiding, that we are Jews in chains, chained to one spot without any rights, but with 1,000 duties. Surely the time will come when we are people again and not just Jews. Who has inflicted this upon us? Who has made us Jews different from all other people? Who has allowed us to suffer so terribly up till now? And interestingly, this entry was deleted from the American stage adaptation of the diary in the belief that it was too specifically Jewish for a general American audience. In the play, Frank's reflections were transformed into a declaration about the universal nature of suffering, stating, "We are not the only people that have had to suffer. There have been people that have had to, sometimes one race, sometimes another." However, in choosing to record this quotation from the book, Kathrada provides evidence that he was drawn to the particularity of the Jewish characters of Anne Frank's exhaustion. And I would like to give you another short entry, which was written, I think it was 3 weeks before the Gestapo raided on the annex on July 15, 1944. And this passage epitomizes Frank's idealism, and it also appears in Lecota's speech from 1994. It's really a wonder that I haven't dropped all my ideals, because they seem so absurd and impossible to carry out. Yet I keep them because in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart. I simply cannot build up my hopes on a foundation consisting of confusion, misery, and death. I see the world gradually being turned into a wilderness. I hear the ever-approaching thunder, which will destroy us all. I can feel the suffering of millions, and yet, if I look up into the heavens, I think that it will all come right, that this cruelty too will end, and that peace and tranquility will return again. The phrase, "in spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart," is the most cited entry from the diary and has long been considered to convey the essence of Anne Frank's philosophy. And this constituted the closing line of the American stage adaptation and was frequently invoked in speeches, movies, book reviews, But Katrada did not choose only this sentence, but the whole surrounding passage. And this choice indicates a different kind of reading and identification. Anne Frank refers here to the suffering of millions without mentioning the victim's Jewish identity. However, 3 weeks before she was caught, it is clear that her description alludes to the suffering of Jews under the Nazis. The passage is a significant expression of Frank's own identity as a Jew, and it movingly expresses her optimism as a means of enduring the misery and suffering she experienced. And I think that for Katrada, this combination of optimism with the acknowledgement of the Jewish suffering are main points of identification with the diary. I would like to conclude by going back to an interview that Katrada did with Tim Cousins in 2008, where he stressed that Anne Frank and her family were given refuge by a Dutch family at great risk for themselves. And he says, as happened here, where Mandela, was given refuge when he was underground by a number of white families who took great risk. So those were similarities. However, we must stress that the condition under which Anne Frank, the little child, lived was much, much worse than ours. But yet, you can't escape the similarities. So here too, it is clear that Katrada recognizes Anne Frank's Jewish identity and the unique circumstances of her suffering. His repeated emphasis on the significant differences between his own historical circumstances and Frank's reflects the empathic unsettlement to which Lacapra is referring. This unsettlement does not lay on the identification of Katrada and the other prisoners of the apartheid regime with Anne Frank, while erasing the differences between the historical circumstances of the Holocaust and apartheid. Instead, it marks the particularity of the Holocaust, pointing to a contextual understanding of Jewishness on the part of the prisoners that nevertheless is put into key negotiation with the overreaching need to oppose racism in its South African context. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that talk, Ronnie. That was so illuminating, and learning how the influence of the Anne Frank diary had on the prisoners. One thing that I'm sort of, I know you spoke about the book being smuggled in. How did it actually get smuggled in? How did that actually happen?
So that's a great question. I think it was the first question that I asked Katrada when I met him. And there was no answer. He said that he did not recall how it was smuggled, but we do know that there was a library in Cape Town that donated all of its books to Robben Island at some point in the late 60s.
Yes.
So my guess was that maybe this was the way that the book arrived.
Yes.
But it remains a mystery, unfortunately.
And you also mentioned that Ahmed Katrada went to Auschwitz and the Warsaw Ghetto. What was his interest? That was like the early 50s. It's not like people spoke about the Holocaust and people would visit Auschwitz. So what sort of drew him there?
So that's a very important question, because Katrada was a youth leader, and at a very early age, I think it was when he was 12 years old, he joined the Young Communist League in South Africa, and so he was inspired by the ways in which the communists were teaching about the war.
Yeah.
So he got exposed to Nazism, Nazi Germany, the ghettoization, and the Jewish persecution through lectures and talks in his youth movement.
Mm-hmm.
And then in 1951, when he went, and in his recollection, he actually speaks not only of the Jewish sides of the war, but also of other sides of the war. He mentions Lidis in Czechoslovakia, and he mentions Dresden, and compares actually Dresden to what later he recalls of Sophiatown and District 6, the destruction that he had witnessed there. So it is quite interesting to see how he negotiates between different kinds of perceptions of memories. Mm-hmm. Is very much affected by the communist narrative of the war, the anti-fascist narrative. Although, you know, when I interviewed him, he said, I was never really a communist. It was just that the Communist Party was the only one that accepted non-white people and struggled against apartheid. But he was exposed to Nazism at a very young age, and it is very important to know that anti-Semitism in South Africa and pro-Nazism in South Africa was very strong ever since Hitler went into power in 1933, and proto-fascist organizations, mainly from Afrikaner right-wing movements, were very visible in the 30s and the 40s, and they were not only targeting Jews, as I mentioned, and this did not escape his recollections as well.
So we have a question from Tully Nates in South Africa. Her question is, can you talk about the connection that Kathrada made between the visit in Warsaw and Auschwitz and the diary for him?
So I have to say that one very important story that I didn't mention was I'll go first to Auschwitz. When Kathrada went to Auschwitz, one of the things that he told me was that he went through the crematorium, and on the ground he saw human remains, and he decided to take some human bones with him. He put it on a bottle, into a bottle, and he took it with him to South Africa. He decided to use it as a material display of the consequences of racism. And when he told me about it, the first thing that I asked is, well, where is the bottle of bones? And he said, well, the sad thing was that during the 50s, Kathrada had to go underground. In 1954, he was, and it's actually amazing because after he passed away, the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation were amazing, and they gave me, they let me, see all his personal collections, and I could see in his personal archives how I had all the secret police reports on him. So he was followed wherever he went. He was a youth leader. He spoke publicly a lot during the 50s. And when he went underground, in one of the raids on his apartment, Afrikaner policemen came. They found the bone. They asked him, what is this bottle of bones? And when he explained that those bones are bones of Jews who died in Auschwitz, the policeman said, well, it's only Jews, and they took it. So this is one thing, but I could find in his speeches from before the raid how he actually displayed the Battle of Bones and told his audience about Auschwitz and about the Jews who died because they were Jews, and compared Hitler to Milan's policies. And I really think that this experience in Auschwitz, and he went to Auschwitz with an Afrikaner friend whose parents were pro-Nazi and very nationalist. And he went to study abroad. He studied in London, and then he met him, and they went to Auschwitz together. And he said that, this visit was so meaningful for him because of his background. So I think that the visit was very formative for him. And he also said that this is why he decided to leave Europe and to go back to the struggle in his homeland. And I believe that this visit in the Warsaw Ghetto and in Auschwitz made an impact on him that actually went on when he read the diary.
Thank you. Do we have any other questions before we sign off? I'm just also curious, the diary was, inspirational to everybody. What was the actual aspect of the diary? Just the fact that she was a young girl in hiding and her optimism. What was it that was actually so inspiring to people like Kathrada and Mandela that they picked up from her diary?
Yeah. So I can say for Kathrada that one thing was that she was a child. Kathrada was the younger senior political prisoner. He was in prison when he was 34. He never had children. And during the interview, he kept on telling how he missed children, and that the fact that she was a child and her wisdom and her optimism in that young age was very much inspiring for him. So I think that one is one angle. And I think that what kept on, what we could see in all the testimonies was that it was the optimism and the optimism of a young girl, despite the fact of a very racist reality that she lived in. And I think this was the main point of identification. Yeah.
Well, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. So at this point, I'd really like to thank you again for a truly captivating discussion. And you really gave us insight into the lives of the prisoners in Robben Island. So I want to be considerate of everyone's time, so I'll close this out. Thank you everyone for joining us on this webcast.